Welcome. It's great having you all here. Wow, 15 years goes by in a blink of an eye, and I cannot believe we're coming to the end of 2024. You know, I was reflecting the other day about 2024 because it sure has been one hell of a crazy year. Think of just a short window of time that happened in this country from about the last week of June until November 5th this year. We had a presidential debate where it exposed our current president having lacking his full mental faculties. Shortly after that, we had our former president, who's now running for the presidency, who had an assassination attempt and literally by a half an inch could have been killed. Then we had the Democratic Party toss out their president, replace it with the vice president candidate, and doesn't go through any kind of, real vetting or voting process in the primary. And then we have a very contentious presidential campaign, and probably the greatest political comeback in American history. President Trump gets reelected. I mean, you talk about a crazy 24. That's crazy. Let me tell you, for me, 24 was the ultimate roller coaster ride. As many of you know, I ran for the U.S. Senate. Still a little tough, but came that close. In fact, at 1 a.m. that night, I was called by the NRSC and said, "Welcome to the Senate. Pursuant to our models, you have won." But then at 4:30 in the morning, ballots got dropped, absentee ballots in Milwaukee and Racine, and somehow the things got flipped. But it is what it is. When you do something like that, it's literally the ultimate roller coaster ride in life. I probably gave 500 speeches, was with President Trump in many big, large stadiums giving speeches. I probably did, 300-400 press interviews, probably 300 radio interviews. Every day you get up, you're being attacked. You turn on the TV, and you're being told that you're a jerk and everything else. You get adulation, and you get swung all over the place. So 24 has been a crazy year for this country, and it certainly has been for me. And it has been for our country from an economic standpoint. So you're all here to listen to me talk about economics, not about what's happened in 24. So let's get into it. First, I have to go back to last year's predictions. I knew last year was going to be difficult to predict, but I'm going to run through it pretty quickly. If it's in red, it means I missed it. If it's in gold yellow, that means I'm on the dartboard, and if I'm in green, I kind of hit it. So I said last year the U.S. economy will run out of gas, the U.S. will enter a recession, and could turn into a hard landing. However, GDP will be lumpy with one potential positive quarter in 2024. Well, that did not occur. Due to government spending, which I'll get into in a second, and consumer spending remaining resilient, the economy did not go into recession, and we had positive GDP growth throughout the year. Second prediction was the unemployment rate. Corporations will start to downsize in 2024, and the unemployment rate will slowly lift throughout the year, but remain slightly below 5%. Employment clearly softened, and the unemployment rate rose to 4.4% before it dropped back down to 4.1%. However, employment data has been erratic, and I'll get into that in a second. Interest rates, the Fed will most likely have to only have one more 25 basis point increase and will be forced to cut rates at some point in mid to late 24, but do not expect cuts more than 75 basis points in 24 unless a global crisis ensues. I hit that one right on the mark. The Fed did not have another 25 basis point rate increase, and they in fact cut by 75 basis points. Then on the Fed's balance sheet, the Fed will continue with quantitative tightening through the remainder of 23 and will be forced to stop again in the first half of 24. Well, the Fed continued, but they didn't stop, but they vastly reduced the amount that they were rolling off their balance sheet. So I'm on the dartboard for that. Then if we look at asset values, I said U.S. equities, the markets will have a 15% sell-off in the next 6 months as investors realize the country is entering recession. Once the Fed indicates that it will pivot, the equity markets will have a moderate rally. Well, that one, man, I got really wrong. Equities saw no sell-off, recession never materialized, and the equity markets had one of their best years ever. Fixed income, the bond markets, after having 3 consecutive down years, will reverse course and have a positive year in 24. Well, the bond markets did reverse course and had a very strong year in 24. So I got that one right. Residential real estate, housing values will continue to decline by up to 10%, but remain more resilient because of limited supply. Housing values, different data, because there's 4 different data points for housing values. Some have it a modest decline, some have it a modest increase, but certain markets like Austin, Vegas, and markets in Florida did see a 10% decline. And then commercial real estate, CRE values will decline through 24 as foreclosures, distress sales will become a significant part of transaction volumes. Multifamily will surprise to the downside given its outperformance over the past decade. Commercial real estate values largely did decline. Distress sales occurred primarily in office. Multifamily saw a spike in delinquencies and defaults. Retail and industrial saw the least stress. Now, the one prediction I said last year, and I think it shocked a lot of people, I said the one thing last year that I knew almost for certain that would happen is Joe Biden will not be president after the next election. I said it's my only strong conviction. Well, man, oh man, did I get that one right. Joe Biden was pushed out of the race in July, and Donald Trump was elected president. Senate, Republicans will retake the Senate with West Virginia, Montana, Ohio flipping back into Republican hands, garnering 1 seat majority. The Republicans have a decent chance of winning up to an additional 3 seats. West Virginia, Montana, Ohio, all elected Republican senators, as I predicted. And we did pick up 1 additional seat in Pennsylvania, unfortunately not Wisconsin. If you can't laugh at your own failures, then what can you do? House representatives, there will be losses and gains by incumbents of both parties, but Republicans will retain a modest majority. That's exactly what happened. And by the way, we still have 1 seat, I think, here in California where they're still counting the votes. Are you freaking kidding me? You know, American Idol could count, what was it, like 120 million votes and do it in 5 minutes, and the state of California can't even count a congressional district in 2 weeks. And then globally, there's a 50% chance that China blockades Taiwan. China did not blockade Taiwan, but continues to add pressure and engage in military activities around Taiwan. Further, China has become very aggressive in other parts of the South China Sea. So those were my predictions. Some I missed wildly, some I got on the board, and some I nailed. But, you know, you got to review what you had to say. So, all right, let's get into this here. All right, so why did the economy do better? Well, the biggest reason is one reason, and that's the politicians kept the party going. They kept spending money at an absurd pace. So let's look at it. So this is GDP, gross domestic product, how we measure our economy. This past year, the economy grew overall at 2.8% if you blend the 3 first quarters. We don't know what fourth quarter looks like. But largely, government spending has kept the economy afloat, where we had total outlays of $6.7 trillion. That's a 10% increase from 23. Folks, that's absurd. Second, consumer spending has also remained resilient as personal consumption has grown at an average annual rate of 2.5%. Consumer spending, you can see that right here. Consumer spending tempered, came down a little bit, but remained steady. You can see where the greatest spending happened: non-store retailers, food service places, motor vehicles. Now, a big part of that is inflation. That's driving those numbers into a positive territory, but spending remained relatively resilient by consumer. And remember, 70% of our economy is driven by the American consumer. Now, if you look at the servicing or the manufacturing industries, they become very bifurcated. And this has been going on for almost 2 years now. We track it. The two most important ones are US ISM services, PMI, and US ISM manufacturing. If you look at our manufacturing sector, it has largely been in recession for about the last 22 to 23 months. The line 50, anything over 50 is expansion, anything under 50 is contraction. And throughout the rest of the presentation, when you see a gray bar going vertical, that shows a recessionary time frame. So if you look at 2020, that is obviously during the heart of COVID when the economy was shut down. So what were the main reasons why the economy remained more resilient? Well, I already indicated two of them. One, federal spending. Two, consumer debt binge. Three, illegal immigration. I know that's going to confuse a lot of people. And lastly, the equity market boom. So let's get into each and every one of these. First, federal spending. In 2024, the federal deficit was $1.8 trillion. This accounts for 6.2% of real GDP growth. Now think of it. The economy, I told you, grew at about 2.8%. That means more than 100% of our GDP growth in this economy today is coming from deficit spending. That's not government spending, that's deficit spending. And if you want to talk about scary, that's scary. In 2024, the first month of the fiscal year of 2025, total federal outlays were $584 billion. So if you look at the red graph, that's the trend line, what it should have been on, and the blue graph is what they did spend. Obviously, the big spike up during the COVID lockdowns, but you would have thought that would have come back down to baseline, but Joe Biden and the Democrats spent ungodly amounts of money, which I'll get into in a second. The last 12 months, we've seen federal outlays of $6.9 trillion, and we basically have added $10 trillion of debt in just the last 4 years. I showed this graph last year because I think it gives you a good visual of just what they've done. The blue lines are all the different spending packages: the CARES Act, the Consolidation Appropriate Act, other related spending, American Rescue Plan, infrastructure, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, totaling $7.3 trillion. Those were on top of just baseline government spending. Discretionary is largely funding that came out of a lot of these programs. Formulaic is just formula spending that the federal government shares with states. And it just shows you what happened. Now, I live in, my home is Madison, Wisconsin. Very liberal city. Wisconsin was a swing state. You could not drive around my city without having roads ripped up literally everywhere in the last 2 years. We're a big university town. The amount of buildings our university took down and rebuilt were ungodly. And what was happening? Joe Biden and the Democrats, what they did is they took a lot of that COVID money that they allocated and appropriated in 21 and 22, but they spent it in 23 and 24. Why? Because they wanted the economy doing well going into his reelection. The problem that they created, and they were warned by, is that you are going to ignite inflation. Because when we sent all that transfer money to individuals when we were locked down, the rest of the economy was on its knees. We shut down businesses. People were being laid off. But by the end of 2020 and the beginning of 21, when the lockdowns were released and the economy was roaring back, they kept dumping more and more money into the system, and it was just like putting fuel into a fire, and they ignited the worst bout of inflation we've seen in 40 years. And that ultimately, with illegal immigration, are the two issues that cost the Democrats the election. And you can see it here. This is just looking at what has happened since 2000 with our debt. You can see the red line and how in 2020 it just totally deficits, just totally cratered downwards, and the amount of deficit spending we've engaged in. I mean, literally, in just the last 20 years, we've racked up, 24 years, should I say, $22 trillion in debt and over $10 trillion in just the last 4 years. Now let's look at the second reason I said why the economy remained resilient, and that was consumer spend. Consumer spending continued to remain resilient. The concern is that it has been largely done with credit card and other forms of debt. The blue line is motor vehicle loans. Actually, I think that got reversed. I think that's credit card, and the red line's credit card debt, or auto debt. But you've had an explosion in debt by the consumer in the last few years, and certainly this year. Now, the next issue. I said it's kind of confusing, illegal immigration. Now, this graph really doesn't show it in a complete light. This is what illegal immigration was under the Trump administration, and then what illegal immigration was under the Biden administration. Total illegal crossings. However, what we know is that the numbers under the Biden administration are vastly higher than that. It says here that according to U.S. Customs, it's 8.6 million illegal immigrants. But because the border was just opened and people were flooding across, they had no way to calculate. Most realistic estimates estimated anywhere from 11 million to 20 million. I've spoken to many sheriffs on the southern border. It was a hot issue, obviously, in politics, and most of them put it at about 16 million, give or take. And that's how many people we poured into our country. Now, my state of Wisconsin's 5.7 million people. Think of that. Literally in the last 4 years, we've almost tripled the population of the state of Wisconsin in our country. What it also doesn't show the amount of legal immigration, and one of the things that the Biden administration was doing was making it super easy that were people coming here illegally to go through the process and get legal immigration. Sadly, those people that waiting outside our country trying to go through legal immigration were constantly getting pushed back for trying to do the right thing because they were putting all these people pouring in illegally in here into our country. Now, the question is, why would that support GDP? Well, think of it. If you have that many people coming into our country, they have to eat, they have to have some place to live, they have to get to a job, so they need transportation. GDP is a very poor way of calculating economic prosperity for an individual. So it will push up GDP, but on a per capita basis, it doesn't mean Americans' lives are getting better. But if you jam in another 5% of people into a country, that's going to create a headline GDP growth, and that clearly played a role in it. The last issue is the equity markets partied like it's 1999. And man, oh man, did the equity markets have a big party this past year. Let's take a look at it. Financials were the top performing sector, and that largely happened right after President Trump got elected. A lot of the gains happened just in the last month of November. Communication service, information technology, utilities, consumer discretionary industrials. You can see the rest. But if you look at those gains, year to date, the S&P is up 27%, the NASDAQ's up 30%, and the Dow's up 19%. Unbelievable gains this past year. Now, if you look at the market, a lot of those gains were driven by the Mag 7. Apple, NVIDIA playing the biggest role in it, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, Meta, and Tesla, all having outsized gains. If you look at them, they were up 38.6%, and they were the big driver of a lot of the gains in the S&P 500. If you just take equal weighted index of the S&P 500, it's up 18.5%. So the Mag 7s were really behind a big part of this growth. Now, I know a lot of people out there probably own stock in some of these companies. To me, as a value guy, I'm sorry, this is insane. Apple at 39 times earnings for a company that's fully mature, that's having a hard time with more iPhone sales. NVIDIA, great company, game changer, but don't you think at some point there's going to be other competitors that are going to come in and this AI boom's going to cool? Microsoft, again, great company, but trading at such a high historical valuation when it's a fully baked-in, mature company. Amazon at 46 times earnings. What do you think their earnings are going to do when we go into the next recession? And I could go through, and obviously Tesla, it's more valuable than all the auto companies, just about all the auto companies in this country, and most of all the auto companies combined in the world. It's insanity, the valuations that are being placed on these companies. And, when it corrects, look, they had these big moves from 2000 to 2000, end of 21, beginning of 22, and then they had a very sharp correction. I fully expect that you're going to see that correction coming rather soon, in fact. All right, so the equity markets have entered another bubble. There's no question about it. This is looking at the two different graphs. The first one is the S&P Forward PE ratio. And right now we're at 21.9%. The only times we've been up there were 1999 during the internet bubble. And then in 21, when we had all the money that the Fed was pushing into the system through quantitative easing, that pushed that big bubble up, and then all of a sudden the Fed started having to increase interest rates, and we had the big market sell-off in 22. But there's other ways, and I'll get into it here in a second, to show that this is actually a bigger bubble than it was in 21 and in 1999. Second is profit margins. We had super outsized profit margins for a period of time during the COVID lockdowns and shortly after that. But as you see, profit margins are starting to drop back to historical trend lines. Now, a good way to look, and I've used this graph before, and this is the Buffett indicator. Obviously, Warren Buffett's considered one of the three greatest investors of the last, 100 years in America. He created this indicator a long time ago, and that's looking at a compilation of the Wilshire 5000 index, the biggest, broadest index of equities, against gross domestic product. Historically, the Wilshire 500 index, and I could take this back, 50, 60 more years, always kind of tracks what GDP growth is. Well, come 2012, it started to lift and separate from GDP, and now it's gone hyperbolic. Why did that happen? Why did that happen? Why did the equity markets get so much more overinflated than they historically did? It's real simple. It's because when the Federal Reserve really started just pumping money in and massively expanding their balance sheet. They started that in 2008 and 9, but because the economic growth had cratered, that money hadn't fully moved into the system, and we were having to repair from the great financial recession. But once we started repairing, all that additional money in the system has to end somewhere. And where has it ended up? A lot of it in the equity markets, which has driven the equity markets to a level that, frankly, don't make a lot of sense. Now, here's another way to tell you what corporate insiders. Now, who would know their companies better than the people that run them? Well, if you look at this, you can see we have a record number of corporate insiders selling stocks in their own companies. This graph goes back to 2004, so 20-year look back. You haven't seen a time where this many corporate insiders are selling versus buying their own stock. So be careful if you're invested in the equity markets. I don't think this coming year, and I'll get into that, will play out nearly as well as this past year. But there's a lot of signs that this market is really hitting a peaky bubble point and it's probably getting ready for a correction. All right, let's talk about the housing market. The housing market's frozen. We have a very dysfunctional housing market right now. This is what's happened with housing sales activity. It has absolutely collapsed. Not as much for new homes because they're the only ones putting new supply on. But take a look at this. This graph goes back to 2000. You see the big peak up in 2004, 5, 6, 7 before the collapse and the housing bust and the great financial recession. Then you see the market slowly climbing back, never getting back to those peaks, but it's had almost an equal collapse. And literally the amount of homes sold today, existing homes sold, are where we were at the bottom of the housing bust during the great financial recession. New homes, again, down, not nearly as bad as existing. Well, high prices and low inventory cratered sales. Again, the blue line is total homes sold. So you can look back, again, it takes it to 2004. We're literally down. The only place that was worse was beginning of 2010, where new homes or home sales were lower. So we're right now on an annualized rate of about 4.5 million homes sold in this country. Housing values, on the flip side, have remained incredibly lofty. I thought they would have sold off a bit more. We clearly have seen it, as I mentioned earlier, in markets like Austin and parts of Florida and really frothy markets that really boomed, seeing a big correction. But housing values as a whole have held up there. It's interesting. The collapse in 2008 was driven by a flood of sellers who were sitting on bad mortgages, IO, payment mortgages, all the rest, with very limited buyers. Today, it's a lack of sellers with a younger generation desperately trying to own a home. Now, a big part of why activity has been so low is because of inventory. And I showed this graph last year, but I think it's important to remember because this plays such an important role in the housing market. And that is, when interest rates collapsed in 2000 during the COVID lockdowns, everybody went out and refinanced their mortgages. So if you look at the dark, kind of blackish line, that shows how many mortgages are below 3%. 25%, if I can see those numbers correctly. People that have mortgages between 3 to 4% are 33%, and people between 4 and 5% are about 15%. So literally, we have 73% of all mortgages of people in this country that have a mortgage rate below 5%. Well, if you're going to sell your home and you go buy a new one and you have to get a new mortgage, what's it going to cost you today? High 6s, low 7s. That is why people are not selling their homes. And that is why inventories have been so low. And we can look at it right here. Again, the red line's housing prices, and the dark blue line is housing inventory. And you can see the utter collapse in inventory, even lower it got than it did during the great financial recession. Now, here's the interesting thing. We are finally starting to see a change in inventory levels. And I think we're going to start seeing in the year ahead a fairly big change in inventory levels. Now, typically, there's certain reasons why people have to sell their home other than they just like a nicer home or a bigger home or adding more kids. It's death, divorce, job loss, job changes. But another dynamic has unfolded, and that is the cost of homeowners insurance. Homeowners insurance is skyrocketing everywhere. In Florida, think of what just happened in the Carolinas with that hurricane. You're going to see rates explode there. Think of what's happened here in California. The place where my wife and I have a home, we can't even basically get homeowners insurance because we have a house that's on the canyon and there's fire risk. So it is becoming a major problem. And then the other issue is property taxes. You know, in this state, you got Prop 14, but in most states, property taxes are escalating tremendously. So a lot of people are being pushed out of their home because they can't afford the homeowner's insurance or the new property tax hits. So I think we're going to start seeing inventories continue to go up, and we've seen 520,000 new supply coming on, and in almost every single market, you're seeing this happen. In fact, in Newport Beach, you're seeing it happen. And everybody would say, oh, inventories won't change, Newport's so tight. No, it's happening here. Now, another issue, because of these incredibly high prices, homes are unaffordable. This is looking at how much household income it takes to own and buy a home. 7.2 times. Now, historically, that number is, from 1959 to year 2000, that was less than 5 times your annual income that it would take to buy a home. 7.2. This is higher than the peak of the housing bubble. Folks, this is not sustainable. It won't be sustainable. And if you want to look at something sad for younger people, this is the age for a first-time home buyer, a repeat home buyer, and all buyers. So, in 1982, for a first-time home buyer, you could be 29 years of age. For all buyers was 31 years, and for repeat buyers, 36. Look at the ages now. For a first-time home buyer, 38 years old. I mean, I remember I bought my first home when I was 28 years old. To think it would be a decade later for all buyers is 56, and for repeat buyers, 61 years old. That's nuts. That is completely nuts. So I think it's going to change because the law of economics matters and math matters. And this is all unsustainable. And I think the year of 25, we're going to start seeing that correction happen. All right, commercial real estate. Commercial real estate continues to be stressed. This is total commercial real estate transaction volumes. After peaking at $239 billion in the fourth quarter of 2021, total commercial real estate transaction volumes have fallen to just $43 billion in Q1 of 24. This is kind of delayed data, so you don't have current data on it, but you can see the fall off. And by the way, these little, the graphs, blue, dark blue is office, red is multifamily, yellow is retail, and light blue is industrial. But you can see the tremendous drop in sales activity. Transaction value for office CRE, only $6 billion in Q1 of 24. That's almost nothing. And distressed sales are picking up. Now, let's look at what's happened to cap rates. And when you think of a cap rate, if you don't know exactly what a cap rate, just think of a yield. So when you buy, multifamily, the low yield was 4.9%. Multifamily has moved up to 6.1%. For office, the low was 7.1. It's now 8.9. And by the way, I don't believe this data. This data all comes from CoStar. And CoStar is an aggregation of small big all over the country, but if you're talking any major metropolitan area, your cap rate on office is probably double digits. Industrial moved from 6.2 to 7.6, and retail 6.7 to 7. Now, this coming year is going to bring a lot more pain for the CRE market. Why? Because last year we had a big wave of maturities where people that financed their properties 5 or 10 years ago, or whatever the duration, all of a sudden those mortgage rates got repriced at a much higher rate. Well, this coming year, we have another tremendous amount of mortgage refinance. Now, what happened last year, a lot of banks extended and pretended. We'll give you more duration, we'll move up your rate a little bit, we'll work with you. We'll still see some of that, but if the cash flows aren't there, eventually the banks are going to say, it's not working, we're going to have to take the property back. And you're seeing more and more of that, particularly in commercial office. So when you're looking at these graphs, these are just looking where commercial mortgages sit. The dark blue is banks, the red is CMBS, the light blue is life companies, and the green is the GSEs, and the gold line is, private debt funds. So I think there's going to be a lot more problems coming for commercial real estate this year, but I do think transaction activity is going to pick up, because you're going to have a little bit fall off in rates, you're going to have more distressed sales, and the weak hands will have to sell, and stronger hands will start taking over assets. And then lastly, this shows what's happening with commercial delinquencies and showing the increasing stress. Again, green is retail, obviously at a massive stress during the COVID lockdowns where people couldn't go out and shop. But that's been coming down. It's still, it started a little turn back up. Office, you can see that gold line just going straight up for delinquency rates. Multifamily, again, going up. Industrial's the only one that really, is staying pretty darn low. So look, the stress, you can see it showing up in every area across CRE. Now let's go take a look at the labor market. Is the employment as robust as it has been made out to be this past year? And if you're wondering, that's Tom Cruise and Jerry Maguire when he's being informed that he's being fired. I don't mean to get political here, but employment data is clearly weakening, but the employment data is a mess. And at first, a lot of people thought that the employment data was just because of COVID and participants by corporations reporting and all the rest. But it started becoming pretty darn clear that the Biden administration was fudging numbers, because I'd never seen a time frame where every single first Friday of the month they'd put out, the job numbers. And they always, with the job numbers, they put out the revision numbers of the last month. And for literally, I think it was 22 out of 23 months, you'd see this big job numbers posted, but the revision was always lower. Usually a revision will be higher, it'll be lower, it'll jump all over month to month, as they're just trying to, fine-tune the numbers. But literally every single month, 22 out of 23 months, I believe it was, they were revised lower. And then in the summer, a whistleblower at BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, came out and said, they've really been fudging the numbers. And then they had to rush out and announce that, we have a negative revision of 818,000 jobs. So the job market has not been anywhere near as strong as what the press were making it out to be this past year. And clearly, we're starting to see that happening in the payroll data, which is the establishment survey. That's where you survey companies and ask them, how many people are you hiring? Well, if you've seen the latest couple months, the numbers have gotten very poor. The last one, where jobs were just growing by 12,000, versus the 180 to 220,000 that we were seeing or thought we were seeing. Interestingly, the unemployment, which is the household survey where they call households and ask people, are you employed and are you fully employed? That number was going up and was increasing pretty quickly up to 4.4, and then all of a sudden, for a couple months, I think it was August or September, that number started coming down, even though the establishment survey was starting to show that job growth was weakening. So these numbers which typically correlate were not even correlating. And again, there are probably politics going on involved in our job numbers. The main point is the job market isn't anywhere nearly as strong as what the press has been telling us the past year. And it's very clear that it is now coming out. And it's probably why the Fed was cutting rates, but I'll get into that in a little bit more. The other thing about the job market to show that it's not nearly as strong as you would think is the amount of government jobs that were created. Remember, I said that the Biden administration took a lot of that COVID money, planned it to be spent in 23 and 24 to have the economy strong going into the re-election. Well, a lot of the job growth, if you look at it, has been government jobs, and that is what that first graph shows. The other dynamic is foreign-born employment. A lot of jobs have gone to illegal immigrants. And the native-born is the blue line. And as you can see, that's kind of moved sideways where foreign-born have really moved up tremendously. And that is a big reason why a lot of lower-income Americans, not only because of inflation, but because of what was happening to their jobs, because illegals were taking their jobs. And, I was in communities across my state. That was a big issue for a number of people, like in the city of Milwaukee. This is just showing that employment hasn't fully returned to pre-pandemic levels. The labor force participation rate, this just looks at how much of our population workforce is participating in jobs. It was up, historically it was always up in the mid-60s, 67 if you go back to 2000. It has been falling. Pre-pandemic was 63 and call it a half, plunged. It still hasn't gotten back to there. Today it's at 62%. And then the number of full-time employment is tracking below. A lot of the job growths over the last 4 years has been part-time jobs. So this brings me to what kind of economy are we operating in today? Many of you may have heard this term, the K economy, and I can tell you this is absolutely 100% true. You got to know that, I literally for 9 months ran from morning to night. As I said, gave 500 speeches. I was inside factories. I was in small towns, big cities. I was everywhere. You really got a sense of what was happening in the economy. So what does it mean by the K economy? What it means is this. If you're in the bottom 50% of the population from an economic standpoint, you've been crushed. If you don't own a home, every single one of the things you buy has gone straight up, and your incomes have not kept up. In fact, real wages declined over the last 4 years. We've never had a 4-year period where real wages actually declined. If you are in the top 20%, you've done very well. Why? Because you've owned stocks or bonds or whatever, businesses, and you've made a ton of money because the equity markets have boomed. And if you're in that middle, call it 30%, where you own your own home, you owned it before, or bought it in 2020 or before, well, your home value has gone up. You probably refinanced your mortgage at a low rate, so you've had some good savings there, but then the cost of everything else has hit you, and you don't own a lot of other stocks and other assets. So you've kind of gone sideways. So again, just like a K, bottom 50%, you're being crushed. The mid part, you've kind of gone sideways. And if you're in the top 20%, you have done fabulously well. And we can see that by looking at this. The top 20% continue to separate from the bottom 80%. Mean household income has continued to expand among the different wealth classes. In 2023, the mean household income for the top 5% earners in the U.S. was $526,000, compared to $297,000 for the top 20% and just $68,000 for the bottom 80% of earners. That is huge disparity. The top 10% earners of the U.S. own 67% of the wealth, while the bottom 50% only own 2.5%. Look, I don't mean to be a populist, but I am going to be a little populist here. This is wrong. I've benefited because I own assets. But we can't operate in a society where 50% of our society is struggling day to day, and the people sitting at the top have so much money they don't know what to do with it. Now, there's a lot of reasons this has unfolded, and frankly, a lot of it is government spending. In fact, the greatest wealth inequality happened under the president that talked about wealth inequality all the time, Barack Obama. That's a fact. Because when you deficit spend and you don't put policies that are good for businesses and good for earnings and incomes, what do? You rely on the Federal Reserve to keep the economy afloat by printing money, and by printing money, as I've talked about in the past, what does printing money, what's the first thing that inflates? Asset values. That's why stocks are overinflated. That's why real estate got massively overinflated. That's why, assets across the whole. Now you're seeing hard commodities, gold. But if you can't own those assets, you're being crushed. And this has to be fixed. And folks, it will get fixed at some point in time if this continues to go, either in a very civil way or in a very uncivil way. And I pray and hope that we get on with trying to address the root causes. And one of the biggest issues, not to go off, is our education system. If you're wealthy, you can send your kids to private schools, and you can make sure they get a good education. But our public schools in this country have become an absolute disaster. And in my state of Wisconsin, it's only like 30% can read at grade level, and even a lesser amount are proficient at math. And in the city of Milwaukee, that is less than 10%. You have certain schools where no kids come out that can read at grade level. I mean, you are putting them permanently in a hole and never being able to dig out of that hole. And we've got to be very serious how we address public education in this country. And my God, I hope they shut down the Department of Education, because since that damn department has been created, the quality of education in our country has done nothing but go straight down. Wealth distribution. Top 0.1% share of wealth is 13.5%. 1% is 30%. Top 10% is 36.5%. 50 to 90 is 30%. The bottom 50, 2.5%. The blue line is the top 10%, showing the 67.7% of all wealth. And the bottom 90 is the red line, showing 33%. So this has to get changed, and let's hopefully we get on with good economic policies that help everybody grow their wealth and their earnings power. All right, troubling trends. That movie is just so rich with different visuals. You just can't help it. I mean, The Hangover is one of the all-time great movies. All right, so what am I concerned about this? When I look into 2025, what causes me great concern? Well, first of all, it's the consumer savings have now run dry. The top graph is looking at aggregate personal savings. That's the blue line. The red line's the trend line. As you can see, what the trend line, the red line was going with the blue line. All of a sudden, you had this massive increase and spike in 2020 and 21 of personal savings. Why? Because the federal government was transferring money, stimulus checks, all the different things that the federal government did to push money into the hands of people. And people couldn't spend it. A lot of them were sitting at home. They did start to spend it on fixing up their homes and all the goods they were buying, but they couldn't go out to restaurants, they couldn't travel, and all the rest. So you built up a lot of savings. Unfortunately, the American consumer has a penchant for spending money. And they didn't keep and retain those savings. They spent it, and they spent a lot of it. So we can see by 2022 that savings started dipping below trend line, and now it's well below trend line. And then if you look at the aggregate excess savings in the lower graph, it peaked out at 2.2 trillion, and now it's 725 billion below trend line. So, the American consumer is in bad shape. And when we talk about, the savings rate at 4.4%, that factors in government transfer payments, things like welfare, things like food stamp, all the rest. If you back that out, the savings rate is negative 6.5%. So the American consumer is running out of steam. And you can see this right here, which I talked about earlier. Credit cards and auto debt, and how much debt the American consumer has racked up. Well, the interest rates on credit cards haven't come down, even though the Fed has dropped rates by 75 basis points. But the delinquency rate, the red line on credit cards, are shooting straight up. And that's not showing any sign of slowing down. And we can also look at the cracks in the auto market. This is subprime delinquencies. They've reached all-time highs. They've actually surpassed what happened during the Great Financial Recession. Next, companies. What's happening in the corporate market? Well, corporations across industries are struggling. This is looking at every single year from 2010 to 2024, corporate bankruptcies. As you can see, the blue is bankruptcies through October. The red is through the balance of the rest of the year, because we don't know what the rest of the year is. But if we project, it's going to come in at about 684 bankruptcies, which the only higher year was 2010 during the Great Financial Recession. So corporate bankruptcies are ticking up across the board. Some notable bankruptcies: Spirit, Red Lobster, Big Lots, Wheels. I just saw something, I think it's the Container Store getting ready to file for bankruptcy. So a lot of different companies are starting to file. Now, this is a little technical. I've talked to people about this in the past. This is the yield curve. What is the yield curve? It's looking at the differential between rates, the 2-year versus the 10-year. Typically, in a healthy economy, the 2-year rate is going to be lower than the 10-year, because you're going to demand a higher yield to store your money and buy a bond for a 10-year duration. You're taking duration risk. But every time the yield curve inverts, where long rates go below what short rates are, it has always been a predictor of a coming recession. So when you see the zero line going across and you see that blue line going below it, that is when the yield curve inverts. And then if you see when it inverts, you go out typically 18 months, you hit that gray bar, which shows recession. And interesting enough, it has been a pretty darn good indicator of every coming recession. But it generally starts when the yield curve starts to uninvert. And that's because the Fed is starting to have to take short rates down and long rates start moving up or do not come down at the same clip. And that is what is happening right now today. So if you look at it, a lot of people are saying this is a pretty good indicator that we may be heading into recession. But the biggest risk of all, those are all troubling trends. This is the big issue. This is the big kahuna issue that we will be dealing with as a country literally for the next 2 decades. The damage that we've done has been unconscionable to the government's finances. This is government debt. Look at that chart. We have $36 trillion in debt. It previously took us 234 years to rack up the amount of debt that they've racked up in the last 4 years. They basically bankrupted our country. That red bar down there, those are the 10 largest banks, the total balance sheet of the 10 largest banks. You know, some would say we got to tax the rich more. You could tax Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk. You could just confiscate all their wealth. You're not even going to make a dent in what you're with this debt. This is the crisis of our lifetime now. And in fact, they're racking up another $1 trillion in debt in about every 4.5 months. And you can see the debt to GDP. We peaked out after World War II when we were fighting a war. We had to rack up debt. But the good thing is after World War II, we brought all these people back because the economy, our GDP, was all war-based, and all these people came back, and our GDP grew, and particularly with all these soldiers coming back, getting married, and starting businesses and starting families, and the population was booming. So we were able, through financial repression and some really difficult years in the 40s and 50s, because leaders back then were disciplined and would make the hard choices to get our country's finances right, versus today, we cured our debt problem. Today, we're at our all-time high. Well, we peaked out in 2020 because, again, GDP was suppressed. But now GDP's back, and by the way, we've used a lot of inflation to try to inflate our debt away, but we're at 122%. Typically, it's by most historical studies, anytime a country gets more than 90% debt to GDP, they get into economic trouble. And now we're at 122% and growing. This is going to be a big issue for the next couple years combined with that, and that is the Treasury debt maturities. We've got $7.5 trillion of Treasuries coming due. The average yield on Treasuries due in 25 is 4.35%. One of the greatest financial mistakes of all time was done by Secretary Janet Yellen, our current Treasury Secretary. She had the opportunity when rates were low to extend maturities and push out a lot of the U.S. debt into 5, 10, 15, 20 years. She didn't do it. And because of that, the interest cost on our debt, which I'll get to in a second, is starting to eat up government spending at a quicker and quicker clip. It was gross negligence on her part. Now we got another problem. Foreign investors are still buying our debt, but at a much lesser rate. They have decreased down to buying 24.3% of all of our debt from a peak in 2014 of 34%. China is the biggest one that has stopped buying our debt. They're shrinking their Treasury holdings. Japan has largely remained steady. They were always the two biggest buyers. We're going to have to absorb more and more of this debt internally, and that is depriving capital in the private sector. Look, one thing we know in economics is $1 spent by government gives you less than $1 in return. $1 spent in the private sector will give you more than $1 in return. So we are continuing to eat this debt burden that the federal government has created is continuing to eat up internal capital and will become a bigger problem. Great quote by President John Adams. There are two ways to conquer and enslave a nation. One is by the sword, the other is by debt. And we've done a good job of that. Well, let's hope these two guys can get something going. You got to say, he's one crazy dude, Elon Musk, but man, oh man, thank God for him in a lot of ways. And Vivek, the Department of Government Efficiency, wow, is that overdue. I mean, you really haven't since probably back in the 50s had anybody look at government and the size of government and rationalizing government. Government is so out of control. I could tell you stories. I went to work when I was in college as an intern at the Department of Agriculture for the Rural Electrification Administration. It was literally created back in the Great Depression to electrify America. Well, by 1962, almost all of America was electrified, but for little parts of Alaska. And yet this department just kept going and going. And I was working there in 1982. Ronald Reagan tried to shut it down. He could never get it shut down. Congress kept appropriating monies. So where was all this money going to? Private private and public smaller utilities co-ops in rural communities. They were making more money than the big public utilities in big cities, and yet they were still getting government handouts. It was insanity. And President Reagan could never shut it down. So hopefully these two guys can shut it down. And one of the best things I've heard is them finally saying, look, if you're not going to be back in your office and at your desk, then just consider yourself terminated. I mean, do you realize federal employees are still not working in their offices? I mean, everybody else in the world is back at working in their offices. Everybody's come back to work. But if you're a federal government employee, you still can be working from home 5 days a week. So let's hope they bring about a bunch of change. But here's the problem. In them bringing about that change, that's going to cause a lot of economic stress. It needs to be done. It has to be done. Because if we don't do it, we're just going to get ourselves in worse and worse shape. But in the short term, when they start slashing those jobs and they start slashing that spending, I already showed you how much of our GDP was dependent upon government spending. So that's why I think we're coming into potentially some difficult times as well. And by the way, Elon Musk basically said that. If you heard what he said, yeah, it's going to cause a lot of short-term pain, but it's a necessary thing. And in the mid to long term, it will be enormously beneficial, and I 100% agree with him. All right, so Uncle Sam ran up one hell of a tab, and now we all have to pay for it. So how do you pay for this? Well, you pay for it through taxes, through financial repression, holding rates lower so you can't get as much money on your savings. And the biggest way how governments have always made you pay for it is through the most insidious backdoor tax called inflation. The red line is core CPI. The blue line is headline CPI. That is the graph on the left, and on the right is PPI. So Consumer Price Index, Producer Price Index. PPI is just looking at producers, businesses, what's happening with them. Obviously, as you can see in both cases, inflation spiked significantly in 2021 and 22. It has been coming down in both cases. However, it has all of a sudden stopped coming down. And, the Fed has said we want to get to a 2% baseline. It is now not getting down to that 2% baseline and is getting sticky. This shows you what inflation has done to the past 4 years. This looks at every presidency. Joe Biden's, where he is at in his presidency right now. And then Donald Trump with his first term, and then Barack Obama over his 2 terms, George W. Bush and Bill Clinton. As you can see, the inflation differential between Joe Biden and all the other presidents. Donald Trump was the lowest, and the rest of them kind of all in that same glide path. this is just an important thing to look at. Sometimes we got to boil it down to, how is this really playing out? Okay? Now, I'm not a big McDonald's eater. Occasionally I'll hit a Chick-fil-A. But I mean, look at this. A Big Mac went from $1.79 to $4.19. Medium fries, $1.29 to $3.89. McChicken, $3.99 to $7.49. I mean, this is crazy. The total price increase is 141%. For Chick-fil-A, a little bit better, up 80%. My wife and I were just flying here from Wisconsin. We went through the Denver airport. We had limited amount of time. I can't stand airplane food. It's just so awful. So we swung by one of these places where they have the little wraps, and they had this little, like the littlest thing with a little hummus and like 4 carrot sticks and a celery stick. Seriously, we grabbed 2 wraps. I mean, they were both really small, and this one little, vegetable thing with hummus. It cost $40. I was like, I almost wanted to put it back. Does $40 matter to me? No, but it's like, how can this be $40? And I look, and I said to my Joe Biden's inflation, and some woman overheard me goes, well, he's not there anymore. So yeah, this is why. I mean, when you wonder why President Trump won, I can tell you there's 2 reasons, without question. 2 reasons. Well, there's actually 3. First reason is this: inflation, without question. Number 2, illegal immigration. It was affecting every community, everywhere. I mean, in Wisconsin, even in a small town of 5,000, we had a Venezuelan illegal immigrant brutally rape a mother and her daughter. We've had killings, all the rest, and it just upset people. And then the last one was all the cultural issues, trying to force school boards across I couldn't believe they were doing this during election. Department of Education was trying to change Title IX to allow guys to play in girls' sports and go into girls' bathrooms and locker rooms. And those 3 issues were really the reason that people just said enough is enough, and why we had this landmark sweep across the board. All right, so what does the Fed do? This is probably one of the biggest questions all of you who own assets, particularly real estate. What is the Fed going to do with interest rates? And we have Jerome Powell on a tightrope. Why? Because, man, he is in one difficult position. He is going to have to thread the needle, and I don't even know if it is possible to thread the needle. Let me explain why. Let's first look what has happened with rates. Okay, so we took a look at rates from December 21 when they were rock bottom lows. Fed fund rates was at 8 basis points, 2-year Treasury at 56, 5-year 115, 7-year 135, 10-year 143, and the 30-year mortgage at 310. You can see the rate differential by December 1st of 23, up 525 basis point rate increase, what the Fed brought about. 2-year Treasuries up 400, and you can see the rest. Now, look at what has happened since December of 23 to December 1st of this year. The Fed has reduced interest rates by 75 basis points, but look at what's happened as you get longer duration. The 2 years only come down by 40 basis points. The 5 years only come down by 8 basis points. The 10 years only come down by 4 basis points. The longer duration of the market's worried that inflation's coming back. And if you look at the Fed's preferred way to look at inflation, it's the PCE, the personal consumption expenditures. And that was coming down very nicely. But all of a sudden it started to go flatline. And now it's starting to tick up. So could we be heading into stagflation? Will inflation be harder to get out? Did they move too quickly by cutting by 50 basis points? Well, they've cut 75, but they did 50, in September, right before an election, which a lot of people thought a little troubling. So what are they going to do? Can they continue to cut if inflation is starting to reaccelerate? But this is their other problem. This is the interest cost on our debt. And you can see how that is absolutely exploded, and why I was saying about Janet Yellen and the failure that she did by not extending our maturities. The interest costs on our debt in this coming year ahead is $1.1 trillion. This is how a debt crisis finally breaks a country, because it's the cost of carrying that debt that starts squeezing out all other expenditures. If you look at 2024, the biggest expenditure, Social Security, $1.46 trillion. Healthcare, $912. Interest costs, $882 billion. Next year, $1.1 trillion. And in a couple years, it'll be bigger than Social Security. So because of this, I think the Fed is going to start reducing rates more than they should, and they're going to accept higher inflation. Sad for the American public, sad for people at the lower income spectrum, because it's only going to make their life that much harder. And by the way, according to 50% of the American public, they're already living paycheck to paycheck. And we saw the strains that are coming through the system. Now, the other big question is, what is the Fed going to do with their balance sheet? This is the Fed's balance sheet. You can see, prior to the great financial recession, the Fed's balance sheet was always under $1 trillion. It ballooned up. The dark blue is them buying Treasury securities. The yellow is agency paper. Red is MBS, mortgage-backed securities. And the blue is other. What is quantitative easing? I've talked about this in the past. I'll give you a quick refresher course. It's real simple. The Fed goes out and buys treasuries or buys mortgage-backed securities out of the banks or out of the public markets, puts them on their balance sheet, sends cash back into the system to stimulate the economy, and that increases money supply. Quantitative tightening, what they're doing is the opposite. They're selling their holdings. So we saw that the Fed peaked out in the beginning of 2022 at about $9 trillion on their balance sheet. They've been slowly reducing, and they're slowing more and more because the markets can't take the strain of them continuing to reduce. That's why they started slowing up, because the 10-year Treasury yield was starting to bump up there at 5%, and they couldn't have that strain. And they can't put treasuries out on the curve, out with longer duration. A lot of people believe that the Fed will eventually have to massively start increasing their balance sheet again, because they may be one of the only buyers for all this government debt. That means we start monetizing our debt, and that means inflation's coming again. So the point is, the Fed's in a really hard spot. If they ease more, they may ignite more inflation. If they don't, the balance sheet of the federal government just continues to worsen and worsen, and they're having to, make a very hard choice. Ultimately, what is the Fed? It's the bank for the federal government. Who will they prioritize? The federal government. That's why I think the Fed will reduce rates, but I'll get that in my predictions for next year. And then lastly, this is money supply. They pump so much money in with all their quantitative easing and their expansion of their balance sheet that helped ignite inflation. They started reducing the money supply. The left is money M2, and then the right is M2 just year over year, and you can see the money supply is back up increasing. All right, the Trump economy. That's with me and President Trump, I think, in Racine. I was with President Trump many times. It was a fun experience, and speaking in very large crowds and to the international and national press. So let's talk about what we know about President Trump that will unfold, because we are having a sea change in economic policies with President Trump versus Joe Biden. I mean, you are going to get very stark differences in what they want to do and how they're going to approach it. the one thing you got to know about President Trump is when he makes commitments, he's very lasered in on that. If you recall his first term, he put together his commitments and he'd always check them off. See, I did this. I moved, the capital of Israel to Jerusalem, and he'd check it off and he'd remind people. Well, I've been with him at many, Trump rallies, and he speaks for a long time. I cannot believe the stamina the man has. But there are a number of things that he repeats and repeats and repeats, and I can guarantee these things will happen. So let's talk about them. Number one, deportation of illegal immigrants. This will hurt top-line GDP, but it doesn't mean it's worse for the American worker, because again, on a per capita basis, it will cause a demand for jobs for American workers, because as these illegals are removed from our system, the businesses will need people to fill those jobs. And by the way, we have more unemployed people out of our workforce of working age than we ever have in our country today because of our social safety net. And so we need to get these people back into the workforce. So we know we're going to have deportation of illegal immigrants. I think it's going to see the used car market soften. I think lower end multifamily buildings are going to take some hits as you move out all these people. It's going to cause wage pressures on some businesses. But for an American worker, their wages will probably go up. Next, Trump tax cuts. They were all set to expire for small corporations, subchapter S and LLCs. They were all set to expire in 25. Well, those are absolutely going to be extended now that we have the Republicans controlling the Senate and the House. And you'll probably see, he's talked about no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. I don't think that one's going to get passed, to be honest with you, because I think it will be impossible to gauge what's overtime and what's not overtime, and a lot of games could be played with that. I think you'll have a hard time getting that through the House and Senate. And on Social Security benefits, that could potentially happen. This is beneficial from the standpoint it won't hurt economic growth. If they would have expired, tax rates for small, medium-sized businesses would have shot up, and they would have put them at a much bigger competitive disadvantage. Next, tariffs. President Trump, I've heard him say it many times, my favorite word is tariffs. And he loves tariffs, and he's already talking about tariffs. Tariffs on China, tariffs on Canada, tariffs on Mexico. Now, he's an ultimate negotiator, so maybe if he can get other countries to lower their tariffs, it will work. But if we get into tariff wars, this could be bad for the economy. Look, I'm a free trader. I believe open markets are great, but they have to be fair and open markets. And you got to understand why we got into the position we are, where we have these massive trade imbalances with the rest of the world. Post-World War II, we were the only functioning economy. So we purposely created trade relationships with Japan and Europe that favored them because our factories weren't bombed out. We were helping them rebuild their economies. The problem is, once their economies got all rebuilt, well, they were in a more favorable position than us. And so we started having these consistent trade deficits through the rest of the world. So he has a big club to wield, because if we get in a trade war or a tariff war with other countries, they're going to be far more hurt than we are, because we're the one running trade deficits. In fact, that's why America went through a great recession in the 1930s, because we were constantly running trade surpluses. And when Europe and America and all the rest of the world got into these tariff wars, it hurt us more than other parties. So we don't know how this will play out. If he can use it to negotiate a lower trade barriers, it'll be beneficial. If it turns into a full-blown trade war, tariff war, then it's going to be problematic. Deregulation will be a major benefit to economic growth and business activities. Regulations are estimated to cost the economy $3 trillion a year. You've all seen it. Look, our business is banking. The amount of regulations in the banking industry is insane today. And we need rationalization of regulations across the board. I've met with more farmers. They all complain about it. So almost every small business, that is their biggest complaint. Next, government spending potentially will be slashed by DOGE. That will hurt economic growth in the short term, but will be critical to the long term. And then lastly, drill, baby, drill. Drill, drill, drill. Their plan how to deal with inflation is to use domestic energy sources, open up pipelines, drill more, and bring down the cost of energy, because energy flows into almost everything, the shipping of every good, the making of almost every good, the moving of us to and from our work, heating our homes and our office buildings. So they plan to be very aggressive with our domestic energy. These are the things we know that will unfold. Outside of that, I don't know. There will be a lot of other things that will come, but when you think about investing and you think about how your business or your assets are positioned, a lot of these are sea changes from what we've been experiencing the last 4 years. All right, real quickly, I'm not going to spend much time on this global economies and markets. Europe is basically bumping around in recession. Germany is basically in recession. France bouncing around, getting weaker. Italy, Spain's doing the best of them all, and Netherlands is okay. But if you look at the Eurozone, their inflation rate's coming down. It is now starting to bump up a little bit. But by all measurements, both their manufacturing and their servicing sector is almost ready to go into recession. And I think Europe's going to have a really tough year this next year. China, I've been talking about this for 4 or 5 years, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. China is in dire financial condition. Their gross domestic product, I don't even waste time. I look at what they report, because their numbers, when they were booming, were stronger than they were reporting, and now they're weaker than what they're reporting. They have a housing bust, 40+ million excess housing units with a collapsing population, which shows the birth rates down here in the bottom right-hand graph. Birth rates versus death rates. Their population could literally shrink by 25 to 30% over the next 20, 30 years. And then lastly, up in that upper right-hand corner, that shows foreign investments. And this is going to be a big problem for them. Western corporations are quicker and quicker to move out of China, reposition out of it. And with Trump and tariffs coming on, this will only accelerate it. And the aggressive position that President Xi has taken towards foreign investment has been very negative. All right, drum roll, the predictions. I have to be insane to try to predict 2025. That's Doc Brown from Back to the Future. And frankly, I probably need a device like that on my head to try to figure it out. Because, man, you got so many cross currents and so many issues coming. So let me give it my best try. For the U.S. economy, there are enormous cross currents that will occur in 25. Trump is inheriting a weakening economy with a severe debt problem. Conversely, the enthusiasm of a pro-business president with deregulation and retaining lower taxes are big positives. My best estimate is that GDP will be lumpy with a negative and positive prints throughout the year, but overall economic growth will come in at a very muted level of like 1.5%. Unemployment rate. Unemployment will weaken as the economy softens, illegal immigrants are removed, and the significant increase in government jobs in 24 will reverse as federal workers are forced to go back to the office and DOGE starts to rationalize the federal government workforce. Unemployment, in my view, will lift to a range of 4.7 to 5.1% as Americans fill the void left by illegal immigrant labor leaving. Interest rates, probably one all of you are very interested in if you're thinking of refinancing an asset. The Fed will continue to cut rates throughout 2025, but it will not be in a linear fashion. Typically when the Fed cuts, they, 25, 25, 25. I think you're going to see them halt for a meeting or two, then it could be a 25 basis point, it could be another halt, but I believe they will continue to cut because I already kind of talked about if they have to make the choice between the American consumer and hammering them with inflation or the federal government and the problems we have with our finances, they're going to try to get the financing costs down for the federal government. So I think we're going to end up at the end of the year with probably somewhere between 75 to 125 basis points worth of rate cuts. Lastly, the Fed balance sheet, they will continue to reduce their quantitative tightening for the first part of the year, but will stop quantitative tightening altogether and may be forced by the end of the year to start buying treasuries again through quantitative easing. All right, prediction for asset values. The rally in U.S. equities will continue through the end of the year and into the beginning of 2025 just because you get a lot of fund flows coming in, mutual fund flows and all the rest, corporation bonuses and 401k flows into the markets in January and February. But then I think pretty quickly after that, we're going to see a sharp reversal of 15, 20%. It could be more. But when the Fed starts quantitative easing again, you could see the market start taking off. Probably not back to the highs we're at, but you could see the market start to take off again. But it's going to be a very choppy year in the U.S. equity markets. Fixed income, I already kind of told you because I told you what rates are going to do. Overnight rates will drop and continue by the Fed's cuts, but mid to longer durations will be more stubborn without a corresponding drop in rates. Don't get me wrong, 10-year, 5-year rates will come down. They just won't come down at the same pace what the Fed's doing with the overnight rate. Residential housing. This one is probably the area I'm most comfortable being confident on. I think housing values will fall from 7.5% to 12.5%. It could be a little bit more nationwide as inventories continue to uptick across the country as homes are unaffordable for the majority of Americans. The driving factor for increased inventories will be investors. Remember, the investor bid into the housing market was enormous. And a lot of these investors are going to wake up and realize they're not making any money. And once housing values start coming down, they're going to panic and they're going to start putting more and more houses on the market. That's what's happened in places like Austin. That's what's happened in places like Florida, where you had a huge investor bid into the market. And then, as I talked about earlier, the impact of rising homeowner insurance costs, property taxes, and employment issues will continue to drive people to put their homes on the market. Commercial real estate. Performance will vary significantly due to asset class and location. Office properties will struggle due to the lack of financing availability. Folks, there's almost no financing availability for commercial office out there. And if you get it, it's very expensive. We're one of the few banks that will do it. But it is tough out there for a lot of people to get financing. Multifamily will see a modest uptick in vacancy rates and delinquency rates as loans reprice due to maturities. Retail will find more difficulty as more retail bankruptcies occur. The big benefit for commercial real estate will be a drop in rates, and transaction volumes will pick up. Because again, I think what you're going to have is you got a lot of institutional capital or vulture capital sitting on the sideline ready to buy assets that go belly up. So I think you're going to see more transaction volumes happen this year. Last set of predictions, global and political. United States, 25, the U.S. will be unprecedentedly crazy. Legacy media will collapse. The economy could go through convulsions with a weakening labor market and yet sticky inflation. Trade wars or real wars could expand. We're living in a very dangerous world today. And I will tell you one thing, which I'll get here in a second. I think the conflict in the Middle East may pick up a little bit, but let's wait till I get there. China. The Chinese economy will continue to worsen as Western companies further their disinvestment from China and the property markets continue to fall. Geopolitical tensions with America will increase significantly. Middle East. President Trump and Israel will go aggressively after Iran. Iran tried to assassinate President Trump. I can assure you there's going to be payback. And Iran has been a cancer in the Middle East. And a lot of the other Middle Eastern countries are encouraging Israel and America to finally deal with Iran. I think economic sanctions are going to come back on Iran in a very meaningful way. That means their oil flow is going to be vastly reduced. But I would not be surprised in the least if you don't see both Israel and American military go after all of Iran's proxies and maybe even Israel hitting Iran like they already have some of their critical infrastructure. So I think that part of the world is going to get a little bit more dangerous here soon. Eurozone will continue to slip into a deeper recession, and political change will continue to sweep across Europe as their economies falter and anti-immigration sentiment continues to build. Look, you go over to Europe and you talk to people, waiters and all the rest, a lot of them are like, we need change in our country. We need somebody like President Trump to reboot the system. And by the way, I wrote this, and what happened last night or this morning? The government of France is probably going to fall. I'm telling you, the sentiment in Europe is ripe. They're angry about the mass immigration that has happened into their countries over the last 5, 6, 7 years, and the economies are a mess. France is in every bit, if not a worse economic position with their debt problems. So I think Europe is going to go through a really difficult time, and I think it's starting in 2025. Lastly, you got to have some fun. A desperate fan base will finally get their first Super Bowl. Either Detroit Lions or the Buffalo Bills will win the Super Bowl this year. Look, I'm a Packer fan, so I want the Packers, but you know what? I'd love to see either one of those teams. I mean, think of poor Buffalo. They went to the Super Bowl 4 times, lost every time. And Detroit hasn't won a world championship, the Lions, since the 1950s, before the Super Bowl was even created. So those are my predictions for 25. I'm crazy for even trying to make them. Look, folks, it was wonderful all having you here. I hope you learned something. I will say, you know, life is crazy right now. The world, I think we've sped up the pace of change, all the rest, and I think it's putting a lot of strain on a lot of people and societies, and I think we're going to live through another very chaotic 2025. So I had a big birthday this year. I'll leave you with this. Live boldly because life is short, man. All right, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for being a customer of Sunwest.